Hello, this is Rocky Marciano. When I was heavyweight champion of the world, they called me the Brockton Blockbuster. You find out why.
Welcome to the Rocky Marciano Archives, a channel dedicated to the life and career of the immortal champion. Following is a 2023 conversation with Rocky Marciano Jr., hosted by this channel's creator, archivist, researcher, and Marciano biographer, John Cameron. We hope you get something out of this. Before we continue, if you enjoy the content of this channel, then hit the like and subscribe buttons. It costs you absolutely nothing but helps this channel towards its aim of celebrating the life of the immortal champion in so many ways. Now on with the show.
Hey John, can you hear me?
Hello Rocco, how are you doing?
Excellent, yourself?
I'm very well, thank you. It's great to see you again. That is a magnificent picture in the background.
Yeah, I figured you might like that. It's a little bit better lighting in here as well.
Exactly, and it's a bit better lighting in here as well. Last time I spoke to you, I was up in the attic, so I was a bit dark in behind.
I know, yeah. Exactly, you look like somebody had locked you up.
Thank you very much for taking the time, Rocky, to make this call with me today. It's fantastic.
No, I'm sorry it's been so long, actually, John.
It's not a problem. It's about 10 years ago. Do you realise that?
You know what? Now, you said that, and I still can't imagine that. I don't know where the time goes, actually. So how's the family? Everybody's good?
Everyone's fine. Everyone's
I'm
fine
good.
on your end?
Everything's good here, yeah. Everybody's healthy and doing well.
Excellent. And I want to take this opportunity. I know I've thanked you on social before when I reached out, but I want to thank you for opening a few doors to me over the last couple of years. I really appreciate that.
Well, no, I'm definitely a fan. I'm definitely a fan of your work and your project and everything like that, and I try to do what I can. And I will tell you, I know we had messaged before about my Uncle Peter, but what I think I should do is maybe give you his email, because he is open to talking to you. I've kept him updated on your project as best I could, because he's not on Facebook, and he's like, yeah, he goes, yeah, I probably was a little cantankerous that time.
I completely understand. And the more that obviously I'm uncovering and stuff like that, I'm hoping by obviously people like Vinny and like Bob Langway and Donna Langway as well, is now that they've come forward and they're seeing that I'm doing it hopefully in the right way, which they're saying yes, you are doing it in the right way. So we're very happy. So if I can obviously get back with your Uncle Peter, I mean, that would be fantastic. But speaking to your family, the other family members, then opening up to Bob Langway as well, because Bob said that he contacted you and you said absolutely speak to this guy because he's good. That's opened up so much research.
He's, you know, it's funny, and I think it's also great that you're able to talk to some of the other family members, because the way I like to explain it is, we all, and this is in every life, in every relationship you have, we all end up having different perspectives of a person. And I like to call it like the you know, it's like a sphere. You know, we have all different parts of our personality, and everybody touches them in different ways. And I think what I've realized with talking to my family members is that we all have a little bit, we all have basically the same view of my father, but there's little differences here and there, or different interactions that they have had that kind of help, like you're trying to do, kind of complete the picture.
You get the brother's perspective, and then you get the perspective of the sisters, which are two totally different because they see them from different angles. So that's what I'm trying to meld it all together to bring the Rocky who's in the middle there somewhere and bring him out to the fore.
Sure. No, I understand, but that's what I think was great. And I believe you also spoke to Perry.
Yes, Perry. Yeah, I've spoken to
Perry.
Yep. Yeah, he's been very helpful. He sent me a signed booklet of Rocky from a training camp, so I'm over the moon with that. That's fantastic.
Oh, wonderful!
I say some of the things that your family's been sending over is just extraordinary stuff. I never thought I'd ever get any of it, but it's wonderful.
Oh, cool. That's nice.
one of the things I'm trying to do is to get people to understand what it is that you are doing for your father and what you're pushing forward for his legacy, to make sure people don't forget who your father was.
Well, I try to do a little bit of everything. I try to, one of the things I do, and I'll start from there, is license and market his name and likeness. And it's not for the money. There's not a lot of money out there for things like that. But what I feel like it does is it helps educate new generations of who Rocky Marciano is. And I would say before internet and social media, I was more concerned about maybe his legacy kind of falling to the wayside, simply because as the game of boxing has changed, especially in this country, where the heavyweight division has kind of gotten quiet, because we have Tyson Fury, we have a couple guys, but we don't have like we used to have, a lot of more fights in that heavyweight division, and the topic of Rocky Marciano doesn't come up as often. So I've always worried about that, but I would say now I have less worry about that because of social media, Facebook, YouTube, and everything like that. I realized people are willing and looking forward to going out and getting that information. And that legacy of Rocky Marciano, I've had this conversation with my Uncle Peter as of recently in the last couple of weeks. I said, with the internet and the way information is shared nowadays, that legacy will last forever. And maybe our concerns before the internet and some of these YouTube and Facebook and social medias, that might have been a concern as people age out of that window of Rocky Marciano and that era of boxing. So, but then there's other things, a lot of people write books. There's people like yourself and everybody that are still interested in telling the story and kind of seeing from different angles. Is it just the time period when they write a story about Rocky Marciano or a book, or is it what made him tick? Or for what I get from you, it's a little bit of everything. Like you're trying to get the full painting and not just a square of the painting or a square of the story, which I find even more interesting. So I do a lot of things, I do a lot of speaking engagements when they come up, and like I said, I'm not worried as much as I used to be maybe 20 years ago about my father's legacy and what will happen to it.
Oh, that's good. That's fantastic. That's something that I'm finding as well, is very much as we go further and further on in time. Obviously, people who were there at the time, even whether they were young kids when in the 60s when Rocky had retired, they're obviously starting tragically to move on, and we're starting to lose the ability to speak to these people, which is why I'm
Sure.
doing my best now to reach out to as many people as I can so they can tell their stories, even if it's just a meeting, a general meeting where they met him maybe when he was out running or anything like that, just so I can capture every single story that I can, because I think it's very important that we tell the entire story of Rocky Marciano, that it's not things or the little things, it's everything at all, so we can actually grasp him as a complete person. Because as you say, Rocky wasn't even born or wasn't even alive when I was born, tragically, and yet I'm still fascinated with this person, so I want to pass that on to others, and I'm getting older now, as we all are, so I want to make sure that I get this absolutely right to pass it on to other people, so when they look into Rocky Marciano, they won't see a guy who fought old men. As the picture behind you, a lot of people will say Joe Louis, the famous Eddie Murphy. He was 138 years old. People will use that against him, or they'll use other things against him. I want to make sure the full picture is told, so we see him from a completely level playing field, and realise, just as I say, the more that I learn about your father, the more amazed I am with him. Being an ex-boxer myself, as you can tell, I really sort of understand some of his peccadillos and his things that pushed him on, and I'm just like, this person was amazing. He had a bad back, he had a bad shoulder, he had a bad elbow, and yet he was still able to do what he did. So he's not just a story of what you can achieve in boxing, but it's a story of what you can achieve in life. Your father should never have been an undefeated heavyweight champion, should he? 5'11", 190 pounds, and yet he did it. very important story that needs to be told.
Well, yeah, and you brought some things up where people may question some of his opponents or say, well, the guys he beat were older and everything like that. And there's a couple things that I would address with that. First of all, how many athletes, especially boxers of that time period, start their professional career so late in life? I mean, because of my father's desire to be a professional baseball player, boxing wasn't on that radar of his till that journey of trying to become a professional baseball player ended, because he had the tryout with the Cubs. It didn't get the opportunity to play for them professionally, and went back home with Ali Colombo. Was like, what am I going to do now? This is where, and I think when you look at great athletes in life, the great athletes, the ones that we put up on that pedestal or say that they're, the GOAT or whatever, are all athletes that overcame either limitations or people's negative opinions about them and doubts of them. And those, such as a Tom Brady for the football players, for people who love football or whatever, Tom Brady. He was drafted in the 6th round. He shouldn't have been the greatest of all time quarterback or argued to be that. Those type of athletes, you sit there and say, that's what's interesting, and I think that's what you find interesting and other people find interesting about my father is, wow, what made him tick? What made him overcome those things? And then when it comes to his opponents, and I like to go back to that, is if you really look at his career, if people really are willing to look at it, the full career, and they'll sometimes tend to lend to the end of the career from like Joe Louis on, is a lot of guys he fought were young up-and-coming fighters as himself, like a Roland Lastarza. And what he did with those people, the people that fought him at that time when he was coming up in the ranks, he ended their career because of the savagery and the way he fought. So it's hard to judge his full career when you look at, well, what happened to all these opponents that, he knocked out so easily early on? Well, those were great fighters. Those were supposed to be the cream of the crop coming up. He ended their careers.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely right, yeah. I mean, you got the classic example of Rex Lane, who was the big up-and-coming prospect. And Rocky, that's the fight that anyone ever says about Rocky Marciano. I don't say about the championship fights or Joe fight, because Lane fight, because Lane fight, because I think, and your father also said this, that was his greatest fight. That he said that was my greatest fight. That was where I was virtually at my peak, because he was just extraordinary in that fight and knocking Rex Lane out in the 6th round. And but going back to, like you say, judging the fighters Rocky fought, because of course when Rocky was first starting out as a professional, 24 going on 25, even though he shaved a year off his age, didn't he, at the start of his career? But,
yeah.
So not that really made much difference. It would have made him 23 instead of 24. But the guys he was fighting, I mean, I'm looking at the old newspaper articles and speaking to people and digging into the details of it. A lot of these boxers, Rocky was the one he was put in there to bolster their records, to give them another name. And of course he was walking through them all when he was back in Providence and things like that. So that's something else I want to make sure people understand.
Yes, and again, it's I appreciate the fact that you're covering like the story, but also the record. When we talk about that fight career, is you have to look at the whole career. Like I said, some people tend, because the names were more familiar, they look at from Louis on, so to speak, because really Louis was the pivotal point, because Louis came out of retirement. Louis behind us here. He was of the attitude, like, he kind of jumped in line of my father towards the title, because they wanted Joe Louis to come back, and what we see in other sports, we like that athlete that we're familiar with and we want to root for, because a lot of people rooted for Joe Louis. So he got kind of jumped in line there, but also later in his career, probably one of the greatest light heavyweight fighters at that time were 2 wars with Ezard Charles. And anytime you look at rankings of light heavyweights, Ezard Charles and Archie Moore are on there. And you want to call them old, Archie Moore went on after my father's fight and had quite a hell of a career and knocked a lot of damn people out still.
Absolutely. I mean, the classic fight with Yvonne Jarrell, wasn't it, after the Marciano fight, where he got knocked down more times than you can imagine, and he still got up and won. And of course, you say about Ezard Charles. I mean, Ezard Charles and Archie Moore, they fought each other quite a lot, and Ezard Charles actually beat Moore more times than Moore beat Ezard Charles. So yes, you're absolutely right. And of course, the weight difference back then, it wasn't a huge disparity in weight either, was it? So it was quite easy for a light heavyweight then to fight the heavyweights as well. And I think what Archie Moore
Absolutely.
and what Archie Moore did in particular, people say, oh, Rocky should have fought Nino Valdez, for instance. He's always a name that gets brought up. But of course, Archie Moore beat Valdez and beat him twice. So
I think the people. No, I know, and I've actually read that stuff and seen it and everything, and that's true. But you know what? There never was really a time where my father now would have avoided a fighter like what we see sometimes now in the fight game. If anything, maybe his manager Al Weil was maybe more cautious, especially towards the end, because he's like, hey, wow, I got a guy that's undefeated. We're in rare territory here. But my father, and I know you know this, but I want to say it since if you're recording this, that people hear this from me as well. One thing my father did not know in the ring was fear. He really didn't fear anybody in the ring. I think his biggest fear as his career went on was losing or failing.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's a famous article where Rocky Marciano mentions that when he was the heavyweight champion, he kind of said, I wish that earlier in my career I'd lost a fight so I knew what it felt like to lose, because there was starting to get that like you say, the absolute fear of losing. He said, I wouldn't want to lose it now because I'd lose the championship of the world. And that's something else that a lot of people don't really get about Rocky, is how much he held that title, which at the time was the biggest prize in sport and one of the biggest things to have in the world. How much he actually held that title with such... He loved being the heavyweight champion, didn't he? And it wasn't for the fact of having the power of being a heavyweight champion, but it was just being the heavyweight champion of the world. And I don't think that fighters today, or certainly for the last probably 20, 30 years, they don't have the respect for the championship that Rocky and others had at that time.
That's true, and I think some of it may be because, at that time there was one heavyweight champion of the world. It was undisputed. We didn't have other belts. We didn't have other champions. So when you said you were heavyweight champion of the world, it was the world. It was the whole planet. You were the number one guy. And I think it goes back to, and probably what you have found out about my father, of some of the things that made him tick. I think growing up in Brockton, growing up in a small town, being part of a big family, and seeing athletes that he looked up to, such as a Joe DiMaggio or a Joe Louis in the fight game or whatever, there was something inside him that either he knew it or he just desired it, but he didn't want to be somebody that nobody knew. He wanted that fame. He wanted that. But he wanted to attain it. I think, maybe nowadays we see people, they want to get their 5 minutes of fame for whatever reason or anything. But I think in his mind, or at least definitely people or athletes of that time period, it meant a lot to earn it, to work hard, be it in baseball or whatever sport you were in, or boxing, that you really put the work in and earned it. And the fighters of that time period, which probably fight fans of now don't really realize, how often these guys fought in a year compared to now. Even if you were champion, you didn't take a year or a year and a half or 2 years off.
Absolutely. I mean, so you say your father used to hate having to fight twice a year because he was very adamant that he needed to fight at least 5 or 6 times a year because he would get ring rusty quite quickly. Could you imagine him these days not fighting for a year or 18 months? He'd hate it. He'd be going mad, wouldn't he?
He would. And I think, and it's funny you bring that up, because a lot of people because again, I go back to the Joe Louis fight on, is because really that's also the most video footage we have of my father's career. We don't have the early career. And I always joke about, I wish my father had fought in the 70s, for example, because that is when TV really was embracing boxing and you were seeing a lot of live fights, and we'd have a lot more live footage. And the people who maybe have a lesser opinion of my father would probably be even more impressed of his fight and his boxing talent if they had more video of it. You know, we know in life that, you know, we can read something, but when we see actual video or something, or that kind of sits with us more and gives us a more distinctive opinion about something. So I wish he had had more video footage of him, but we go back to that latter half of his career and see that fight footage. You bring up the fact that when he had to have maybe only 2 fights a year when you became champion, he would start off a fight slow because he was a little rusty. He was a creature of habit, and he had gotten into that habit of fighting 5 or 6 times a year. So when you change that habit, that slowed his beginning of his fighting, you know, of a fight more so. And he would have to knock the rust off, and it would take 3 or 4 rounds.
Absolutely. I mean, he always said that the first fight in the year that you would have would be kind of his warm-up fight for his second fight, which he kind of explained when he was fighting Don Coquel in 1955, and he said he looked awful in that fight, but it was a tune-up fight to get ready to fight Archie Moore, because if he'd have fought Archie Moore first, he probably would have struggled a bit more on it. So he was very much someone who needed to fight to be able to fight, because he would say as he was coming through the ranks that he fought to learn how to fight, and that was the way he sort of learned back then. It was fighting. So he would have 14, 15, 16 fights a year in the first few years, whereas today you get your Usyks and that, and they have 16, 17 fights and they're heavyweight champion of the world. So
right. Well, I think with the Don Coquel fight there was a lot of things. I think there was the rush because, you know, he was trying to prepare for Archie Moore, but also I think being on the West Coast, I think there was a lot of things that took him out of his rhythm, out of his way of preparing for a fight, which made it look badly. And Don Coquel was a little bit of unorthodox in that fight, and neither fighter really found a rhythm in that fight.
Yeah, that's very true. It's very true. There was I don't know if I ever told you this story. Many years ago, I knew this older person. He was a taxi driver actually, and he said to me one day, he said, "Oh, you look like a boxer," and we got speaking, and I said, "Yeah, my favourite fighter is Rocky Marciano." And he said, "You know," he said, "when I was a kid," he said, "I lived in London, and I was in the car with Don Coquel when he came back from his fight with Rocky Marciano." And he said, "I have never seen a person's face look so misshapen and yet still be able to function as I did when I saw Don Coquel." So it was
wow. Yeah. Well, like I said, you know, he did. It's not just a story, but you hear so many fighters that fought my father that said he was the hardest puncher I ever fought against. Every punch hurt. He didn't waste any punches. He threw a lot of punches, but he didn't waste them here. He was going for the home run knockout every time, and if he was going to hit your, you know, and give you the body shots, he wanted you to feel those as well. Absolutely. And I think, you know, you can see when he training with a custom-made 300-pound bag, because he felt like, well, if I'm fighting guys 200 pounds, why am I only using a 180 or 200-pound bag? I want something heavier. It made sense, but nobody else did that.
No, and they still don't do that. They still don't do it today.
Yeah.
I don't. There's. Well, I mean, I'm going to say I don't think. I pretty much know there isn't a fighter probably around, especially a boxer, who trains like your father trained. He was an absolute maniac, wasn't he, when it came to training?
No, yeah, he was. He definitely. You know, fighters back then, not just my father, but yes, my father was unequaled in his training regimen. But, you know, after a fight, they'd take a few days off, kind of heal up and kind of get back into rhythm. And that's what my father liked to do. And as you well know, and I'm sure the people that follow you know, whenever my father fought or was preparing for a fight, he had different sparring partners for different aspects of fighting, for speed, for power, for, whatever things he may face. He didn't train just specifically for that fighter. He trained for all different aspects of what he could run into in the fight.
Absolutely, yeah, because he would say he would take five or six sparring partners to camp with him for that exact reason. So we had all different lighter
Yeah.
fighters, bigger fighters, punchers, boxers. He had them all. So yes, and I suppose before fight footage was more readily available, so he couldn't sit down and watch fights of the fighters he was going to fight.
Right.
So he literally had to be ready for anything, didn't he? Which is makes him even
Yeah,
more
you basically had to
extraordinary.
have your, pardon me, I'm sorry. You basically had to have your scouts tell you, well, this is what he likes to do. This is his tendencies, whoever your opponent is. You didn't have video, like you said, to go back and look on. And a lot of people use that to their advantage, though, because they would change things up because it's like, all right, this is how you think. I'm going to come into this fight a little differently, and so he wanted to prepare for whatever they could throw at him.
But yeah, as I was saying, the people that your father fought, and this is what I find even more extraordinary and says a lot about your father's character, is that all the people he sparred with, pretty much, and all his opponents, he remained friends with them even after his boxing career was over. And I mean, that says a lot, not just about the time that he fought him, but about the person that Rocky was
Sure.
as well.
Well, yeah, that you early on when we first started our conversation, you talked about how you even talked to people that maybe they can tell you a story of just meeting them one time or whatever like that. And as you know, I was only a year and a half when my father passed away, so I didn't get to have firsthand knowledge of him. So as I grew up, one of the things I would do, and this is probably why I do the things I do, like we discussed earlier, is boxing was still big in Miami. I lived in Fort Lauderdale, so all the boxing matches, all the fighters were coming down. We didn't really have Vegas yet. It was mostly New York, Miami, everything like that. And I would go to boxing matches, and they would introduce me. They'd bring me in the ring, and I probably was doing that at 6 or 7 years old. And I got to have so many people come up to me and tell me stories. And I would say the main theme of every story was how approachable Rocky Marciano was. He's like, people would come up to me and say, gee, you could run into him in a coffee shop and say, hey, Rock, how you doing? And he'd strike up a conversation with you. He was, he was the common man's champion. I mean, he really was. He didn't forget where he came from. He never got big in his shoes. He just was still the everyday Rocky that grew up in Brockton, that ran the streets in his sweats and waved to people and everything like that. And that's one of the things I love that didn't change about him was he stayed that person. And he had a lot of great relationships, always had respect for his opponent. He didn't understand when, for example, when he fought Archie Moore, I remember reading this and also being told this by Marianne and family members how, Archie was kind of like, they were basically the same height, but Archie was kind of standing on his toes, trying to look down on him, almost give him like an evil eye. And my father kind of looked at Allie like, what's this guy doing? He's like, they're the same way, he's on his toes. Is he trying to intimidate me? He didn't understand stuff like that. He was just a kind of a bring your lunchbox type guy. You get to the ring and we're going to weigh in and we're going to get this fight on.
Absolutely, yeah. And you talk of Archie Moore. I mean, Archie Moore, I think your father said in one article at the time, he said Archie Moore's the only one really who's starting to get under my skin a little bit, because of course Archie Moore was so full of his braggadocio, as he would like to call it, and he was pushing for the fight for at least 2 years before it actually happened. So, and obviously they got
Yes.
it on, and Rocky won, and afterwards they went out to a club together that night, and there's pictures of them together with Archie Moore playing his trombone. And so it's a remarkable world. It's a totally lost world in this day and age, which is unfortunate, but an incredible person. After, obviously, during the time that your father was heavyweight champion, I mean, you mentioned earlier that he liked the fact that he was famous and he could walk around and be recognised. But there was a time where he would say that he could walk down the street of New York and not actually be recognised as heavyweight champion of the world. So there was a time in like the 50s, and he wasn't really, the public loved him, but the boxing press at the time used to downgrade him a little bit because obviously he just came after Joe Louis. But as it went through into the 60s, suddenly he found a new renaissance with people like Floyd Patterson, who took over from him, and Ingemar Johansson, who took over, and then Sonny Liston, and then Muhammad Ali was Cassius Clay at the time. So suddenly your father found himself catapulted back up in the pantheon of boxing again, and was probably given more due in the 60s than he actually got during his championship reign. Do you think that sounds about right?
I agree with that. Yes, I think after, well, again, there were a lot of writers that love Rocky Marciano, but then you always have the detractors, because I think a lot of them thought he was a crude fighter. But if you really know the sport and you really watch him, he may have started out crude, but he really took the craft, Charlie Goldman really helped him a lot. And he really, if you watch some of the fights, and there's actually some video clips out there of showing what defensive skills Rocky Marciano had. And I don't think a crude fighter could easily go through a heavyweight career and really, other than getting cut or have his nose split or whatever, really never being hurt in a fight. That's these guys are all very strong, very powerful guys. He was only knocked down twice, and both times he wasn't hurt. He was more like, did anybody see this? I think he was more embarrassed if you look at the reaction both times. And yeah, I think like any athlete, I think, there's that period of time when you retire, you're like, what do I do now? This sports, be it baseball or boxing, has been my whole life, and now what do I do? And I think that's what made him restless. And I think that's where that story comes from, where he could walk down New York, just down the streets in New York, and not get recognized. And yeah, that probably bothered me. Like, why did this go away so quickly? That type of thing. But yeah, he did have a resurgence, and like the TV show, The Main Event, and I think you're familiar with it. That's as far as I know, that's probably one of the first shows that an athlete, a retired athlete, had on TV in that era. To be able to come on and have a 20, 30-minute bit show of going over and narrating a fight that's already happened, and having a guest on, such as a Zsa Zsa Gabor or Jackie Gleason or any of those, top name actors or athletes or whatever that would come on the show. That's pretty remarkable in that time period. I don't think I've, ever saw anything, at least in the 60s or early 70s, that any other athlete quite had that. So, and yeah, he did get a resurgence, but I think it's also came along, not just with Rocky Marciano, but I think boxing had a resurgence in the 60s as well. And we've seen it from time to time, where the ebb and flow of the sport, that's what I was talking about earlier about keeping his name alive, is the ebb and flow of the sport. There's been times where it felt like, now the conversation about Rocky Marciano is fading away because the heavyweight division is kind of quiet right now. And then we get a resurgence again, and the conversation starts, even again with Tyson Fury.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree, yeah. Especially in regards to The Main Event, because that was it was almost an anomaly of a show, wasn't it? And it was a shame it only lasted for one season, but to have a former, and he'd done a fantastic job on it as well, and you saw his character on there. It was lovely to see him on there joking and laughing with his guests. And of course there was the famous story you mentioned earlier about Joe DiMaggio, and there was the famous story, which I'm sure you've heard, in which he obviously met Joe DiMaggio, went to the White House, had his photograph taken with the president and Joe DiMaggio, and he went back to Brockton, and there was an old-time Brockton guy there who said, look at Rocky Marciano there, had his photo taken with Joe DiMaggio, and now he thinks he's something special. So there was some lovely little stories. Yeah, there was some lovely little stories that he told on The Main Event. So I think there was about 23 programs, I think, and there's about 17, 18 of them are available. So
absolutely, I think that's about it. There is, but and I always laugh watching my father on television. The Main Event, the first few, he looked a little robotic and uncomfortable. and you can tell the difference between the early ones and then later on where he became very comfortable with that. And he really was involved in being a boxing analyst for some of the fight game, be it in interviews or at fights or newspaper interviews, and he was really comfortable with that. And that's what we see with in sports in general. We usually see an athlete that came out top of his career or was very well spoken or whatever, really take on roles like that, other than just the professional sportscaster or journalist.
Absolutely, yeah. There's so many photos of him with Howard Cosell where they were at ringside, because he covered the Ali listing fights. He was actually a journalist for that, so he was in the newspapers as the main reporter for that, and I think that was something that he really quite enjoyed, being a writer himself and actually writing about boxing, because he had a great love for the sport even after he retired. And of course at one stage he was campaigning to be a kind of a czar of boxing, so he could make sure that the fighters were protected even more.
Well, yeah, he did a lot. Bringing that subject up leads to a lot of things for me. One is the fact that not only was my father a very approachable guy and very respectful of his opponent. You can see in the fights after he knocked somebody, he'd go over and check on them, thank them for a good fight, make sure they were okay, especially more so probably after the Carmen Bingo fight. And but he also he never, and I think this came from his youth and growing up in Brockton and being an immigrant and everything, he never really liked seeing somebody of power take advantage of people. And he felt, when it came to boxing compared to this baseball, for example, boxers were really taken advantage of by the system, by the manager, by the sport, where after their career was over, if they didn't take care of the money, they were really left, like, all right, bring in the next guy. They weren't really valued after their career. And you bring up the czar part of that. He really wanted to be a czar. He really wanted to see one commissioner for the sport of boxing and have it better controlled and have a pension set up and have a retirement plan set up like other sports had in that time, baseball being that sport that he really focused on. And he was meant to speak in front of Congress regarding that prior to his death. Mm-hmm. And if I recall, if I'm correct in saying this, and I'm pretty sure, Ali kind of took those reins, and Congress did pass some sort of, it didn't really make the changes my father wanted to see, but pass some legislation with Ali's name regarding the sport of boxing and protecting the fighters.
Absolutely, and that's great that you brought up Ali, because that segued perfectly into what was going to be one of the last questions, is the computer fight. Yes, so the computer fight with Muhammad Ali caused a lot of division over the years, with people saying, well, Rocky shouldn't have won, and other people saying Muhammad Ali shouldn't have won, etc., etc. But the one thing that did highlight was Muhammad Ali's complete and utter respect for somebody from a completely polar opposite view of life at the time than Rocky, and yet this person, Muhammad Ali, absolutely adored your father, and never ever in his life did he ever say anything bad about Rocky, which people need to listen to that, because it makes you realise just what an incredible person your father was, that he could have influence over everyone he met in a positive way.
I appreciate that, yes. I would say maybe not 100%, but I would say probably 98% the people my father fought had a respect for him. I mean, you're not going to love everybody, but they definitely had a respect. And I think it really says something about my father's character, and it goes back to approachability and being a regular guy and not really losing that, and being able, he just had that type of personality where he could walk into a room, he takes over a room, but when he was speaking to you, you felt like the only person in that room. And and that's just, some people have that or don't have that. And it is amazing with the relationship between my father and Ali about two total polar opposites. I know my father at times really didn't understand Ali where he was coming from, because that wasn't his nature of it was the same thing he dealt with Archie Moore. Archie Moore was the Ali of his times. Archie was that guy. Archie saw how you had to build up a fight and really get the press going and really do that, which Ali kind of continued on, and other athletes have taken that torch. But my father was the type where he felt maybe a little that was disrespectful to his opponent, so he didn't like to talk big. In camp, he's like, yeah, I'm going to kick his ass, But in fight, no, this is going to be a tough fight. He's going to be a great opponent. He said all the right things because that's how he really felt and how he wanted to interact with people. And I think that, other fighters respect that. And Ali, being that polar opposite, learned a lot from my father, because it was kind of a way like, okay, what does this old guy got when we're doing this super fight? Like I'm young, this guy's old. And he realized not only was he still physically fit, but he could learn a lot from this older guy who's gone through some things. And Ali was at a critical time in his life, dealing with what he was with, the country and his religion and everything. And it's like, hey, you can learn some things from the old guy. And I think they really built a relationship, really close relationship, really quickly, in a short period of time, other than my father just, analyzing his boxing skills. And when they got to do that super fight and film that and spent that time together, a really close relationship grew from there.
It did, absolutely. I believe it was your uncle Peter who related a story about how they would, between rounds, they would sit down and share a piece of fruit together, and they were talking about what they could do together in order to build up like race relations, which were, one can only imagine what, had your father not met the fate that he met, what he would have gone on to accomplish in the 70s and further on from that.
Absolutely. What would he have been doing in the 70s and 80s? He probably would have been even more iconic than he is now, because more people would have been exposed to him, and there would have been that more conversation. And really, in this country, the 70s and in the world, for boxing, 70s were a big resurgence, not just because of Ali, just because of all the great fighters that period had, and leading into the Larry Holmes and Tyson into the 80s and everything like that. It would have been, you would have seen my father all over TV, doing color or analyzing a fight and being that guy on ringside. And that's where I think his life was leading to. Unfortunately, it was cut short. And but I would say, just from my life experience and everything, sometimes fate has a lot to do with your life, and you can't run from it, whatever. And my father's fate was what it was. He didn't fear anything in life, and he didn't think anything about getting in a little plane with a pilot that probably didn't have enough experience to fly it in the conditions it was in. So, but his character, I want to go back to his character. It's like, one thing about my father, and you can see that through sports and through his career and through race relations as it came up, is he didn't see color. You were just a man. And I think that came from his growing up, being an immigrant, coming over here into a very populated Irish community where the Irish had been here. And they were talking down to him. He's like, well, why? We're just people. It's like, so I'm glad to see that he grew from that and didn't repeat it with other races or other cultures. He saw people for people, and I love that about him. And I love how he related to people, and I love how he really looked out for the little guy when it came to it. Joe Louis, for example, I just want to tell this story real quick, is when Joe Louis was having hard times with the IRS and financial issues and everything, Joe and my father ran into each other, and he found out how bad it really was. He says, Joe, let me make some phone calls. And my father was the one that got Joe Louis the job at Caesar's Palace, being a greeter and getting some income again. And he did that quite often for a lot of fighters, that fell on hard times after their career, who didn't manage their money well. You know, it wasn't like, I'm going to give you a handout, but what's that old saying? Instead of giving you a fish, I'm going to teach you to fish.
Exactly.
And that's what he did, and help people.
Exactly. Of course, because one of his closest friends, Toxie Hall, who he sparred with a lot, and Toxie, who actually put him on the canvas in sparring, to which he replied, well, or Charlie Goman said, well, he sparred over 100 rounds with him. If he doesn't know how to hit him by now, there's something wrong. But of course, in later life, But in later life, Rocky got Toxie a job in the Chicago police force and was instrumental in sorting him out and making sure he had a career. And then Toxie retired from the police force and was in the police force for years. So he was always doing things like that, and he didn't see colour, he didn't see race, he didn't see anything like that. You're absolutely, all he saw was another human being, and he just wanted to treat them. If you treat him right, he'll treat you right, and that was the way he was. He hated anything like that, didn't he? So that's another side of his character that is just a wonderful thing to see, and for everybody to actually take notice of and to learn from as well. But Rocky, I am going to say thank you very much for your time. I've taken up almost an hour.
I appreciate it. No, I love.
Hopefully it won't be another 10 years before I catch up with you again on a chat.
No, let's do it soon, really. I mean, because there's so many different subjects to talk about regarding Rocky Marciano. I feel like in this conversation, we kind of tiptoed on a little bit of everything to just try to get a good summary of things, and we could go back and kind of get in a little deeper next time.
Absolutely, as I say, but I'm not going to leave it 10 years because I'm getting a bit more computer savvy this time, and I've got a bit of light.
Good.
So that's all right.
Perfect.
And we're all getting a little older. If I leave it another 10 years, I'll be in my 60s, and well, you're a few years older than me, but let's not say how many.
That's okay. That's okay.
You're actually the same age as my wife, so you're a good age. It's fine.
All right, I'm a good age. That's good.
A good age. You're fine. So
yeah, you can't talk bad about my age with your wife being the same age either.
Exactly. No, I can't say anything. It's absolutely that's perfect age. Rocky, thank you very much. I'm going to sign off now, and I'm going to say have a good rest of your day. Thank you for everything you've done, and I'll be in touch real soon. Thank you very much for today. I really appreciate it.
All right, look forward to it, John. Take care. Be well.
Thank you very much. Cheers, Rocky. Bye-bye now.
Cheers. Bye.
I'll try and find out how to hang up now. There we go.
Thank you for listening. We hope you got something out of this. If you did, punch that like button. Until the next time, we will see you down the road.
Just remember, keep your left hand high, chin down, and keep punching.
If you like this content, then hit the subscribe button. To really support this channel, consider joining for just over $1 a month and unlock ad-free members-only content. Every member will play a key part in revealing the real Rocky.
As soon as the bell rang, it was a completely different person going out there, and I couldn't explain it except I just enjoyed combat. I just enjoyed the sport that I had learned so well, and I had practiced so much that when the bell rang, I did a job. I could concentrate on the opponent. The fight itself was strictly to prove myself as a fighter. I had to prove that I was a better man.